Let's continue with section 1. This particular lecture, we really want to just look at the foundational concepts and ideas that are going to be crucial for dealing with people in the world of sport or sport business. Today we're going to talk about personality, moods, and emotions. So let's start with the first one. And I think it's still important to sort of justify or provide a rationale for why we want to talk about personality. Now, many of you are probably very used to talking about different personality traits. If you're talking about strengths finders or those different types of things, there are a lot of different inventories out there. They've become exceedingly popular the past few years. Well, let's take a step back again, right? I'm big on context setting. And why do we want to talk about personality or understand a personality through personality traits, things like that? When you deal with athletes or you're dealing with other coaches or if you're a leader and you're dealing with employees, then being able to work with your subordinates and your colleagues to be efficient and productive, it behooves you to understand the types of people that you're working with, right? The more you know about a situation, then the more prepared you can be for that situation. That's kind of the basic mindset here. And personality is a good sort of starting point for us because as you engage with others, as you collaborate with others, whether it's in a sales presentation or whether it's installing a new offense or defense, you need to understand who you're working with and who's going to be your audience and those types of things. The more that you understand that, the more that you understand the people that you're working with and that you're trying to reach, then the more efficient you can be in tailoring your communication or the programs or whatever it is that you're trying to do to those individuals, to those employees, to those athletes, to those organizations. Okay? And so a personality, again, we're going with this kind of the basic definition to kick things off. A personality can really be defined as all the consistent ways in which the behavior of one person differs from that of others, and especially in these social situations. Remember back in one of the previous lectures, we talked about the interactionism paradigm, and we talked about the individual and the environment sort of engaging or interacting. That's what we're talking about here. So a good example of looking at a social situation and how it can highlight differences in personalities might be looking at a group situation. Some people are more introverted and they don't necessarily like or are as comfortable with these larger social situations. Others are extroverted and they love these social situations. One's not better or worse than the other. But if you have someone that you're doing a sales presentation with and you know that they're much more of an introverted personality, maybe the value they can provide is in developing the sales presentation or developing some of the metrics as compared to getting them up in front of the boardroom to talk about or try to sell the program. Okay, it's again just trying to understand the nuances of the people you work with or the audiences that you're trying to serve. Well, if that's our beginning point for a personality, then again, in terms of context setting, it helps us if we understand all the different ideas out there, right? So if we're looking at a personality, there are a lot of different types of personalities. We want to explain the differences in where these personalities evolve or maybe how they impact others, where they, we want to understand what makes up a personality, and we want to understand why these personality traits or these attributes manifest themselves the way that they do. So again, we go back to the rich history of psychology, and we can look back at a bunch of different theories that really try to explain some of these major differences. Now, we're only going to talk about 4 of these theories. There are a lot of theories, okay? But again, I just want to kind of provide a little context, a little seasoning, a little basic understanding to help sort of kickstart the conversation of personality, moods, and then eventually emotions and how that all relates to us. Within each of these theories, I'd be remiss if I didn't let you know that there are a number of different either smaller sub-theories or individuals that contribute to them. Okay, I just want you to know going in that psychodynamic theory is really way more complicated than the 2 sentences that I provide here in terms of summarizing it. But we just kind of want to give you a flavor or feel for what these theories look at and how they engage with helping us understand the idea of personality. Okay, so psychodynamic theory focuses really on the unconscious motives And it really starts to look at the person as an entire holistic ecosystem or unit. So they talk about the totality of the person. Basically, they kind of boil things down to the pursuit of pleasure, so something that is good that you want, and you avoid the things that are bad or the pain. All right, and so psychoanalysis is one of the more famous attributes or aspects of psychodynamic theory. And you've probably heard of Sigmund Freud, and he talked about the 3 parts of the personality. And he talked about a lot of things, and he talked about a lot of things in a lot of different ways. But his view of the personality, I think, is kind of interesting, and it serves as just a simple starting point for us. All right, so there are 3 parts or components of the personality. You have the id, which is the sort of instinctual drive of the person. The person, that it's that thing that allows you to move forward as you try to find what is pleasurable to you. Now, when we say pleasure, it's just about, maybe if you're thirsty and you take a drink of water or, whatever your beverage of choice is, then that is something that's pleasurable, okay? So pleasure, pain, positive, negative, these are rather broad umbrella terms, all right? But the id is that people are driven. We have these instincts, and we try to go out and we try to satisfy those instincts. So in the world of sport, some people say that humans are violent, and we have these violent instincts, and sport is a place for that. All right, so that would be an aspect of the id. Then you have the superego. All right, and this is, the inner restraints. It's basically the person recognizing what is allowed and not allowed by society or culture at the time. And that sort of becomes your conscience, right? That's, if you kind of think back to, a video or a cartoon where you had the main character and then like a little angel and then a little demon pops up on their shoulders and they're going back and forth saying, oh, you should go ahead and do this. And then the little angel says, no, you shouldn't do this, right? It's kind of going back and forth, and that's a ridiculous example, but a nice little visual for the id and the superego, all right? So the superego is the feeling of I shouldn't because I understand society says I should not. Okay? And then unfortunately you have the ego. The ego is kind of stuck in the middle. The ego's job is to balance the id, kind of suppress it, and sort of balance back and forth between the id and the superego. What you want to do and pursue as the individual. Maybe it's be violent within the context of a particular competitive game. But then society, the superego, the society says you're not supposed to do this because being too violent is inappropriate. And so the ego is going to be sort of mitigating those 2 constraints. Okay? So that's Sigmund Freud, that's psychoanalysis, which is kind of his point of view, but that all kind of falls under psychodynamic theory. Now, if we're sort of extending what we talked about with the interactionism paradigm, so the role of not just the individual but the environment, that's when we start to get social learning theory. And so this little tag phrase, if you will, a tagline of what we see. And so that's kind of it, right? You see something as an individual, and that something is external to you. Maybe it's another person or something going on, and everything that you see represents kind of society or culture and other people, and then you bring in that information, and then you do something with it, right? So B.F. Skinner, this kind of behaviorism approach, really focused on what you do more so than the emotions. He kind of left the discussion of emotions to other folks. And so if you're talking about positive, negative reinforcement or punishment, that's really what he was kind of interested in, right? So behaviorism, and if you do this, then you get to do this. If you do this, then you don't get to do this. All right? So do rewards and punishments deter or increase behavior? Think about something like, a mandated GPA for student athletes. Now, if that mandated GPA comes from a conference, if we're talking about student athletes, if it comes from a conference or from a league, that's different than if it comes from a coach. But either way, it might influence the behavior of the student athlete to engage in class-related work or materials to ensure that they're able to be eligible to play. Okay, just a little basic example there. Then we've got Albert Bandura, and his focus was a little bit more on role modeling. and this whole idea that we learn by watching and sort of being involved in that. And I think that's really important because, the whole idea of role modeling and imitation and being immersed in a particular environment to learn, that really is kind of the foundation for the internship program that you all are going to be going through as part of program requirements here in sport management, right? So the idea is that you do a practicum and then you do an internship, and you're doing that because you can be out there in the environment. You can learn, you can see what's going on, you can see how your supervisor or your superiors in that organization handle a disgruntled customer, right? And so maybe you will imitate that response, mimic that response if you ever encounter that situation. All right, so that's again social learning there. Two more theories that really kind of help to understand the very convoluted, complex nature of personality. One is humanistic theory, and this is going to emphasize the personal worth, the personal story of each individual. It's really going to focus on the centrality or the importance of human values. And then it's also going to kind of bring in this idea that that human beings are creative, are unique, are active. And as a result, people seek experiences, and they seek out positive experiences because these positive experiences are going to shape who they are as individuals, or from this point of view, their personality, and it's going to drive their actions later in life. All right, so there's been a lot of talk over, the past few years in terms of developing finding your why, understanding your passion, thinking about your own personal core values. All of that discussion, that leadership discussion, really kind of connects with this idea of the humanistic theory. One of the best examples of the humanistic theory is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've probably met that in that particular pyramid in other classes. And we're actually going to talk about that on the next slide. But it really talks about the true, you can meet your basic needs, but to truly meet the needs of you as a person, right? The total fulfillment of you and sort of the manifestation of your personality is when you become self-actualized and start sort of helping others. All right. And again, we'll talk about that in the next slide. Trait theory, similar to humanistic theory, has become really popular over the last few years as we start talking about leadership traits, and you talk about the Myers-Briggs inventory and stuff like that, to understand what kind of personality or the different types of personalities that you might be, or that might be inside of you, and kind of working to engage and really guide who you are, what you do, how you do, why you do things. Okay, and a guy named Dr. Cattell, he came up with this through statistical tests and analyses, these 16 personalities and things like that. So you're more than welcome to click on that and kind of walk through that as well. But this whole idea of both the humanistic theory and trait theories coming back, they've made this huge comeback, and they've done it through understanding leadership. And so now many of you are going to be involved in consuming leadership in terms of personal and professional development. You might be minoring in organizational leadership and learning, or some of you majoring in that might actually be taking this course. And you'll probably see a lot of overlap with some of that discussion, some of that content, some of that work. Here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And it's really rather simple, but it's very impactful. And the famous UCLA men's basketball coach, John Wooden, Hall of Famer, actually went on to write different books and start teaching classes. You can actually get certified in the John Wooden tradition, and really it was using this self-actualization as a basis for his coaching for his dominant UCLA men's basketball teams. And it started with, okay, you have your basic physiological needs, right? You need to breathe, you need to eat, you need to drink, you need to be safe in terms of shelter, right? You can't freeze to death, you don't want to have heat exhaustion, those types of things. Once those are met, then you can kind of come up to what they call the safety needs. And this is going to be different than like shelter, right? So when I was talking about shelter being safe from the elements, it's, the safety needs tend to be much more about emanating from society, right? Someone doing you bodily harm, that's your personal security. Employment would be sort of kind of ties in with financial safety, right? You have the basic finances so that you can meet those needs to be productive and to be kind of at a baseline, the status quo, if you will, in a social environment. Okay. Love and belonging, if we're moving up one step here on the pyramid. This is where your friends, we talk a lot lately in the world of coaching, in the world of leadership, about building connection, right? And that's because from this point of view, it's part and parcel to trying to become self-actualized. It's more than just having a good job. We know, whether it's within sport or outside of sport, people will actually turn down more money to stay with an organization where they make less money because they have a stronger sense of connection to that organization, to the people, to the work, right? So once your kind of financial resources and safety is met, then you start looking at something that might be pretty important to you, and that's friendship. That's that family, that sense of connection or sense of community. Well, once you have that need satisfied, then you come up to the esteem, right? So this is going to be your self-esteem, your freedom, your strengths, recognition, respect. It's those socio-emotional needs are now being met. Once you have that, and that's kind of the basis for building eventually what we'll talk about in terms of self-confidence and things like that. Once you have that, then you can start to pursue self-actualization. And this is the desire to become the best version of yourself. And that's another phrase that we talk a lot about recently in the world of kind of leadership, especially in sport organizational setting. Be the best version of yourself. What does that mean, right? It's something that you have to decide as an individual. It's not necessarily going to be decided by the organization, by the coach, by the employer. Self-actualization always really, it really kind of gets back to that idea that to really become the best version of yourself is now to start sort of closing that loop and cycling back and helping others. That's one thing that you can do, is make an impact with community, make an impact with others. And you start to see this, not just in mental health programming in Division I athletic departments, but also something like mentoring programs within a lot of sport organizational settings, right? Many individuals who've been in the industry a while, they have a desire to give back. And a lot of it's because they're starting to pursue this whole idea of self-actualization. Okay, so we talk a lot about personality and different views on the personality. We know that personality traits, for example, are going to influence or impact your athletic performance. So let's talk a little bit about that. And it's, again, you'll find that psychologists and other social scientists, like sociologists, anthropologists, things like that, are not terribly creative when it comes to naming different things. And I use that not just in terms of tongue-in-cheek kind of a jest, but also if you're ever looking at something, oftentimes the title will tell you exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so the personality performance athletic pyramid really is talking about the engagement, how personality traits or attributes and performance in the athletics setting, how they work together. All right, and what we find, and this is sort of interesting, so just kind of take a moment and walk with me on this. As the skill level, the athletic skill level increases, all right, then personality traits and the sameness or the oneness of these personality traits increases. If you go down into more kind of amateur athletics or athletic settings that are more recreational, so the skill level is decreasing as you go down there, you'll find that there's an increase in the differences among people. So the athletes and coaches are going to be very similar in professional or elite athletic situations. And I think that's really interesting, right? Because you talk about, you need to have athletic talent if you're trying to ascend to professional athletic or athlete status, right? But oftentimes what we find is that professional athletes have similar personality characteristics. Now, we're not talking about personal style or views on different things or whether you like LeBron James or Aaron Rodgers or whomever. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about those personality characteristics, those attributes such as commitment to the game. If we're talking about work ethic, if we're talking about intrinsic motivation, which we'll get to, oftentimes professional athletes have very, very, very high self-confidence in what they do, especially sports-specific confidence, right? Those are the personality characteristics, and those things tend to, the homogeneity, so the sameness of those personality characteristics tends to increase as skill level increases. And all this kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Well, Dr. Kroll and colleagues way back in the early 1970s, they did a pretty interesting study. And they noticed that, the personality characteristics or differences among rookies on a team was highly variegated. There are a lot of different personality characteristics and traits. The veterans on the team tended to be much more similar, right? So the rookies were very different, and they were kind of unique and different as compared to the veterans. And then even within the rookies, there was a lot of diversity in terms of personality characteristics. Well, over time, those rookies would adopt or emphasize the veterans' preferences, values, and kind of quote-unquote ways of doing things. And that's a really powerful, simple, but powerful idea, right? You have a lot of individuals that are very individualistic when they enter into the team, when they're new to it. The longer they're on the team, the more they become like each other. And that's where you start getting that cohesion. Those differences decrease. And that's something that we're going to circle back to. But it talks about the power of personality, but it also talks about how athletic situations or high performance situations, especially team-oriented situations, can influence, or emphasize or de-emphasize certain personality attributes or characteristics. Personality is not static. It's not immobile. It's not monolithic. It can evolve. It can emphasize or de-emphasize certain things in certain situations. Again, we're also hearkening back to that very, very important idea of the interactionism paradigm. Talked a lot about personality, right? Personality is a type of affective state, all right? And affective states are really just the when and the how we react to things in our environment, all right? And personalities are one type of affective state. There are two others that we'd like to mention, moods and emotions. And oftentimes, we kind of assume in everyday commonsensical anecdotal life that, these things are the exact same. And maybe in terms of day-to-day, they have similar manifestations. But for us trying to understand how to contain anxiety, let's say you're a swimmer and a diver and you're getting ready to go up for a dive and you're trying to control your emotions, right? Well, to control your emotions, you have to understand what an emotion is. That's why we talk about and differentiate between personality, moods, and emotions, okay? So a mood is a situation-specific, somewhat kind of fluid, transient psychological response to some sort of stimulus or stimuli in an environment. And that is a very, very textbook definition. So let's break that down a little bit. Okay, it's situation-specific. You get that part of it, right? It's a psychological response that may vary. It's probably not going to be super long-lasting, but it's going to be in response to something that happens in that situation. So maybe you're going into an interview, all right? Maybe you feel a little nervous about the interview. Or maybe you are on a competitive, highly competitive volleyball team, and they're going to be doing cuts, and you're a little bit nervous, or you're feeling some anxiety in terms of whether you're going to make the cut or whatnot, okay? Those are going to be... that's a psychological response to a stimulus, something going on in that environment. If you get the job, you probably feel a certain emotion, right? And that kind of dovetails into the next thing. So an emotion is the mental reaction or feeling. Now, I'm a big proponent of, there are a lot of emotions out there, but we like to boil it down to the major ones, right? Mad, sad, glad, scared, or a combination of these two. All right, let's go back to kind of a I think we used a free throw example in another lecture. And so let's say there's less than 2 seconds left. You have to go up and knock down these 2 free throws. And in order to get it to overtime, right? That's a very different situation than if you need to hit just 1 out of 2 to get to overtime and the second one to win. But you need to hit both of these so that you can get to overtime. All right? You might be feeling some anxiety. And you're like, well, if I'm feeling anxiety, that's not mad, sad, glad, or scared, is it? Well, it is actually, right? Think about the relief. You hit both free throws. Think about you might be happy, but you're also extremely relieved. Well, the relief is the glad and the scared, or the absence of scared, working together. That's the relief in that particular situation. Okay? And so your emotion is what you feel at that moment. What if you miss those free throws? Obviously, you're going to be extremely probably mad, sad, and your mood for the next few hours might be somewhat negative. Okay? And that's how those two things are going to work together. A mood doesn't last very long, but the emotion is really it's really even shorter than a mood. Okay? And if you're a leader, if you're a coach, if you're a team captain, think about how you need to understand moods. How long do you let a loss of a big game linger with the team, right? That's kind of a mood. You want to make sure that you manage emotions. You don't want to get too excited, too happy that you made it to the Super Bowl, right? Because you still need to kind of focus in on some things. You didn't actually win the game yet. You just made it to the Super Bowl. So you need to kind of balance these emotions, and you need to understand in terms of trying to put some parameters on how long we start to let these moods really impact us as either individuals or as a team. Another great way of looking at moods is obviously, as they call it, the POMS, or the profile of mood states. And really what you're trying to achieve is this iceberg profile, simply because it, kind of it's here, then it spikes up, spikes down. It looks kind of like a mountain or as an iceberg, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to chart the different fluctuation in moods for an athlete or a performer in a particular situation, right? And it's kind of interesting because all the different moods that they're charting, tension, depression, anger, vigor, fatigue, confusion, out of all of these, only one of them is positive, and that's vigor, right? Tension, depression, anger, fatigue, confusion. These things you want to try to minimize as much as possible, and you want to spike right here with vigor, the positive mood. And what they found is that those that are mentally healthy in the athletic situation, all right, they're able to kind of stay fairly level on most things, right? The anger doesn't get too high. If something doesn't go their way, they don't get too down. They're able to manage their tension, right? So their anxiety and the feeling that I don't really know what's going on, right? You want to relax. Right? You don't want the situation to be too big for you, those types of things. Now, fatigue is not just talking about physical fatigue. It's talking about mental fatigue. When people, when there's a lot of information to process, you can become mentally fatigued and you sort of check out a bit. You want to make sure that obviously is not happening, right? And then confusion. With all the information, if you're trying to read a particular defense, all the information that's out there, the more you get confused, the more you let that those bits of information detract from what you're trying to do, then obviously the less successful you're going to be. So I think it's also kind of interesting, those that are not terribly successful, you can kind of chart, right? The vigor doesn't spike as high, but it's almost on the same line with fatigue, and then confusion's kind of in the same ballpark as well. And I think that's sort of interesting. If you can even kind of throw in anger over here a little bit, you don't have a lot of differentiation right here. And that's what's bad, right? You want to maintain a positive outlook. You want to know what you're doing. You want to feel confident in what you're doing. And that's really what the iceberg profile is talking about. And I think it's also kind of a nice way to wrap up this discussion of of looking at how, a personality, a mood, and emotion, these affective states, they really work together, right? We talk about them in isolation. They might be in different chapters in a book, or they're on different PowerPoint slides, but humans are not, we don't really operate that way. All this stuff operates simultaneously, psychologically, together at once. And then that sort of bubbling mixture is going to engage and be activated based off of the environment around us. And I think that's really important, because we know the environment can influence things. And I'm not talking about just whether the green is wet or dry on a 25-foot putt, or if it's extremely windy and those types. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this social context, and that environment is going to influence how we engage with whatever we're doing in our particular sport, or if we're performing. And being able to work with and balance that external environment, that's going to be a key skill that athletes, performers, and leaders have to learn. Coaches need to learn how this stuff works, because that's what they're trying to cultivate in their athletes, right? And so the profiled mood states is just a nice little way to kind of look at and understand. And then the iceberg profile is really just graphically representing. But next time we're gonna look at how we start engaging explicitly with the external environment, and that's where causal attribution comes in.